They said family always forgives. But tell me, how do you forgive a sister who humiliated you in front of 100 people? And her CEO boyfriend, I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just sent one email that changed everything. 1 week later, she lost her job, her reputation, and her perfect smile. I'm Lauren Reed, and this is the story of how truth became my quiet revenge. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The snow outside looked like powdered sugar falling over the rooftops of Capitol Hill. Soft and steady, like it had no idea how much it didn't belong here tonight. Inside the Reed house, everything glowed too warm, too gilden, too perfect. My mother Margaret had outdone herself again. Candles on every surface, crystal glassware that could blind you. Jazz humming from a speaker tucked behind a poinsettia. The air smelled like rosemary butter, and a little too much money. Our annual Christmas dinner was never really about Christmas. It was about performance, about proving to Seattle's polite society that the Reeds were still polished, successful, enviable. I sat at the far end of the table, as always, the end reserved for the person who didn't quite belong, but couldn't be left out entirely. My emerald dress was simple, quiet, deliberate. I'd chosen it to disappear, and it was working. Madison, my sister, commanded the room the way she always did. She was radiant under the chandelier, laughing in that bright, effortless way that made everyone lean in closer. Her boyfriend, Ethan Brooks, the CEO of Riverside & Co., sat beside her immaculate in his black suit, his watch catching the light every time he lifted his glass. He smiled when required, spoke little, watched everything. My mother orchestrated it all with military precision, directing the staff, refilling glasses, correcting posture with just a glance. She lived for this, for appearances, for the illusion that we were still the perfect family my father left behind when he died. Madison was mid-story about her latest marketing campaign, something about record profits and a brand transformation, and the guests a mix of executives, investors, and family friends were eating it up. Every number she dropped, every humble brag, drew approving nods. I cut my steak into perfect squares. I didn't eat and stared at my plate, counting breaths. I'd been invisible for most of the evening, which suited me fine. But even invisibility has an expiration date. Madison glanced down the table, her eyes finding me like a spotlight. And speaking of innovation, she said, her smile widening, my little sister Lauren's here tonight. You all remember her, right? She's... what do you call it again? Lore, independent financial consultant. The guests looked my way. I smiled politely. That's right, I said, keeping my tone even. Madison chuckled, swirling the wine in her glass. She's still trying that freelance thing. We call her the family failure. But hey, every family needs one, right? Keeps the rest of us grounded. Laughter bubbled around the table, easy and cruel. My mother forced a nervous chuckle. Someone muttered, "That's funny." I felt the burn rise behind my ribs, but I stayed perfectly still. I'd learned long ago that silence hurts worse than defense. I looked down at my plate again, pretending to fix my napkin, my pulse thrumming in my ears. Across the table, Ethan's laughter didn't join theirs. He was watching Madison now, the curve of his smile gone flat. He set his glass down slowly, the crystal tapping once against the tablecloth. Interesting, he said, his voice calm but sharp enough to slice through the noise. But you're our failure. We're done. The room went still. A sound, small but piercing, filled the silence as Madison's wineglass slipped from her hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood through linen. For a second, nobody breathed. Even the jazz had the decency to stop. My mother's face drained of color. One of the guests tried to laugh but caught himself halfway. Madison blinked, eyes wide, searching for words. But there were none. Ethan didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He just sat there, composed, like he'd said exactly what needed to be said, and nothing more. I stared at the pieces of glass near my chair. The reflection of the chandelier fractured across them. Sharp, dazzling, broken. My hand trembled slightly as I set down my fork. "Excuse me," I whispered, though no one seemed to hear. I pushed back my chair. The legs scraped the floor. Loud, jarring, and the sound felt like punctuation in the silence. As I walked past the table, I caught Madison's eyes for the briefest moment. They were wet and furious, full of disbelief. She looked smaller somehow, as if the perfect shell she'd built around herself had cracked, and all that was left underneath was fear. No one tried to stop me. Not my mother, not Ethan, not the guests who suddenly found their napkins fascinating. I passed the Christmas tree, its lights flickering faintly, and stepped out into the cold. The air bit hard, clean, and honest, in a way the house never was. My breath clouded before me as I crossed the porch and leaned against the railing, closing my eyes. From inside, I could still hear the faint hum of voices rising again, the clinking of dishes, the sound of my family pretending nothing had happened. The snow had started to fall heavier now. It melted against my cheeks, cool and soft. I thought about Madison's laugh, the look in Ethan's eyes, the weight of years of silence pressing on my shoulders. That night, I didn't know if I'd just lost my family or finally escaped it. Rain woke me before the alarm did. The steady tapping against my window sounded like a metronome keeping time with the ache behind my eyes. I didn't dream much anymore, but when I did, it always took place in that house. Rooms, too polished air, too thin. The kind of dreams that leave you feeling like you're still being watched. I made coffee the way I always did, slow and methodical. Boil, pour, stir, repeat. My apartment overlooked Lake Union. The ferries below cut through the fog like small ghosts, their horns low and tired. I wrapped myself in a sweater, the kind with a hole in one sleeve, and waited for my phone to light up. It didn't. No message from Madison, none from my mother, just one from Ethan. We need to talk. Not about her. I stared at it longer than I should have, thumb hovering above the screen before hitting delete. Whatever he wanted to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. The coffee burned my tongue. I let it. It was something to feel. I sat by the window watching the gray city wake up beneath the drizzle. The memory of last night replayed like an old film reel. Laughter sharp as glass. The sudden silence, the way the wine had bled across the tablecloth. It was strange how something could end, and no one would even notice the moment it did. I reached for my tablet and opened the morning news. The top headline glowed across the screen. Riverside and Coney celebrates record year-end profits. I almost laughed. Perfect timing, I muttered. The universe had a dark sense of humor. Numbers. That's what I understood. Not people, not pride. Numbers. They didn't lie. When life fell apart, I always went back to them. I opened my laptop, the familiar hum of its fan like white noise. Spreadsheets, invoices, balance sheets. Columns and rows lining up like soldiers in formation. Order in chaos. I lost myself in formulas for a while, letting the rhythm of clicking keys calm me. Then my phone buzzed a vibration sharp enough to pull me out of it. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Sophie Lynn. Sophie and I hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years. We'd worked together at Riverside before I quit. She was good, smart, precise, too honest for her own good. I hesitated before answering. Hey, Soph. Her voice came fast low like someone who didn't want to be overheard. Lauren, do you have a minute? Sure. What's going on? Something strange is happening with the marketing accounts. My stomach dropped a little. Strange how... Let's just say your sister's name keeps showing up where it shouldn't. I went still. Outside, a seagull screeched over the lake, slicing through the quiet. You mean in financial records? Yeah. Transfers. Repeated ones. All approved by her login. I leaned back in my chair. Maybe she's just sloppy. Sophie let out a humorless laugh. Madison sloppy. Come on. You worked under her long enough. Everything that woman does is curated. She wasn't wrong. Madison Reed was incapable of mistakes. Or at least she thought she was. Ethan's opening a review. Sophie continued. He suspects something, but he doesn't know who's behind it. I thought you should hear it from me before it gets ugly. I rubbed my temple, staring at the rain streaking the window. Thanks for the heads up, but why me? Because you're not there anymore. You're the only one who can look at this and not be afraid of her. There was truth in that. Maybe too much. When we hung up, I sat in silence. My fingers traced the edge of my coffee mug, now cold. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Tired, maybe older. I thought of Madison's voice echoing across the table, that cutting laugh, the way she said the family failure. Maybe she was right. But I also knew what failure could teach you. Things she'd never learned from winning. I closed my laptop and pulled out an old folder labeled Riverside, 2019. It still held fragments of projects I'd once audited. Madison's name was all over them, her signature smooth and perfect, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. Back then I quit because I couldn't breathe under her shadow. Now her shadow was creeping back toward me. Outside, the rain grew heavier, tapping harder against the glass as if it wanted in. I thought about Ethan's text. We need to talk. Not about her. Maybe he already knew something. Maybe he was drowning in the same storm and didn't know how to say it. But I wasn't his confidant. I wasn't anyone's anymore. I scrolled through my messages again, hovering over Sophie's thread. Then I opened my email drafts and typed a note to myself. Check Riverside public filings. Compare vendor accounts for inconsistencies. Possible pattern in Q3. I stared at it for a while before saving it. My chest tightened. Not fear exactly. Something else. A quiet recognition that this wasn't over. By late afternoon, the city was wrapped in fog. My reflection in the window blended with the skyline, like I was half there, half gone. The ferries kept crossing, steady, unbothered, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Sometimes justice starts as a whisper, not a battle cry. And sometimes that whisper sounds a lot like your own voice asking what comes next. The coffee shop on Fairview Avenue smelled like espresso and wet coats. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. It beat against the wide glass windows, blurring the skyline into something soft and gray. I sat near the corner nursing a cup that had gone cold, tracing my finger along the rim. Every few seconds I glanced at the door. Sophie was late. She'd always been the kind of person who arrived early, who hated being unprepared. So when she finally came through the door, hair damp coat clinging to her shoulders, I knew whatever she had to say was serious. She spotted me right away and crossed the room, her heels clicking against the tile. "Hey," she said, breathless. "Sorry. Traffic was hell." I gestured to the chair. "You look like you ran through the entire storm." She gave a weak laugh and sat down, pulling an envelope from her bag. "You didn't get this from me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. I looked at it, the manila paper warped slightly from moisture. "What is it proof?" She pushed it toward me with both hands. "Just look." I hesitated before opening it. Inside were printed pages, expense reports, payment authorizations, vendor transfers. Rows of numbers jumped out, but the pattern took only seconds to see. Same vendor name, same amount, same approval. Again and again. Over $320,000 in duplicate transfers, Sophie said, her voice tight. Sophie said all signed off under your sister's authorization code. My stomach sank. Madison Sophie nodded. Every one of them. It's routed through a fake marketing firm out of San Francisco. The address is a rented P.O. box. Payments have been coming through since August. I stared at the looping signature. Madison's elegant M, her name stretched across the page like it belonged there. I'd seen that same signature on campaign reports years ago when I still worked at Riverside. It was perfect then. It was perfect now. I looked up. Does Ethan know Sophie bit her lip? He suspects something. He asked for a quiet internal audit, but he doesn't want to act until he has hard evidence. I'm part of that audit, but... She lowered her voice. Madison's too connected. People are scared to point fingers. I flipped through another page, hands trembling slightly. And you're showing this to me because I know what she did to you, Sophie said simply. You don't owe her silence. And if you know how to read financials better than anyone here, maybe you can help me connect the dots. The rain outside thickened, streaming down the windows. A couple nearby laughed, oblivious, their voices echoing in the empty space. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. You know she'll burn anyone who crosses her. I know, Sophie said. But someone has to start the fire before she does. Her eyes were tired, but there was something fierce behind them. The kind of resolve you get only when you've already decided you're past saving yourself. I slipped the envelope into my bag. If anyone asks, you never saw me. She smiled faintly. Wasn't planning on it. We talked a few more minutes, about her team, about Riverside's new board members, but my mind was elsewhere, already building the math in my head. Transfers, accounts, vendors. The numbers had their own language, and right now they were screaming. When she finally left, I stayed behind, staring into my untouched coffee until it went cold again. The rain had turned the streets outside into mirrors, reflecting streetlights that looked like smudges of gold. I walked home with the envelope pressed against my chest under my coat. Every step felt heavier than the last. At home, I kicked off my boots, turned on a single lamp, and opened the folder again. The pages spread across the table like a confession. My living room looked smaller under the warm light, almost claustrophobic. I sat down and studied each page in order. The same account numbers, the same digital signatures, the same trail. She hadn't even tried to hide it cleverly. That was the arrogance of someone who'd never been told no. My laptop blinked to life, the blue light harsh in the dim room. I opened a blank email. The cursor blinked at me, patient, expectant. To compliance, Riverside & Co. Come subject internal irregularities. Marketing. I typed, carefully choosing every word as if it could be traced back to me. Duplicate vendor payments identified between Q3 and Q4. Pattern suggests deliberate misappropriation of marketing funds. Please investigate the following accounts for irregularities. I listed 3 account numbers pulled directly from the reports. Then, after a long pause, I added one last line. Sent anonymously for the integrity of the company. My hand hovered over the mouse. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I thought of Madison's laugh at the dinner table, her words echoing in my head. The family failure. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd never been good at playing the game. But that didn't mean I couldn't end it. I clicked send. The message disappeared, replaced by a clean inbox, and the small, silent confirmation. Message sent. I sat there for a long time staring at the screen, waiting for something to happen. Lightning, guilt, relief, anything, but nothing came. Just the same soft sound of rain against the windows, steady, unbothered, cleansing the city below. Revenge wasn't the goal. Balance was. The city was gray that morning, the kind of gray that seeps into your clothes and stays there. Riverside in Coty looked like it had been carved out of glass and steel, its mirrored windows swallowing the skyline. From the street, it looked powerful. From the inside, Ethan Brooks stood in silence, watching rain slide down his office window like slow-moving veins. The email printout sat on his desk. Anonymous, concise, accusatory. He'd read it twice already, the language too clean to ignore. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. Someone who understood the internal structure, the reporting systems, the patterns that shouldn't exist. He turned the paper over and picked up the phone. Daniel, come to my office. A few minutes later, Daniel Reyes walked in, rain still dripping off his coat. He was 40, efficient, polite, always smiling, just a little too much. You wanted to see me? Ethan didn't look up immediately. We've got a discrepancy in the marketing expenditures, duplicate vendor payments, recurring entries. I want you to check it. Daniel shrugged, casual. Probably just a vendor duplication. Happens all the time. Those guys recycle invoices like old coffee cups. Then check it. Ethan said, his voice calm, but clipped. Daniel hesitated just long enough for Ethan to notice. Sure. I'll have it on your desk by Friday. Make it Wednesday, Ethan said. Daniel gave a half smile. You got it, boss. Then he turned and left. When the door closed, Ethan leaned back in his chair. The city's reflection rippled across the glass. He knew Daniel too well. He'd seen that look before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in people with something to hide. At noon, he forwarded the email to the compliance department with a short note, cross-verify the vendor logs from Q3. Quietly. Then he minimized the window, stood up, and looked out over the city again. Seattle looked tired, the rain relentless, the streets slick with light. I imagined him there holding the weight of that single email in his hand, knowing it could fracture everything he'd built. I hadn't wanted him dragged into this, not yet, but there was no avoiding it. That evening, their house on Queen Anne Hill glowed warm from the outside, like every magazine ad for success ever printed. Inside, the light felt different, colder. Madison poured herself a glass of Chardonnay, still in her blazer from work. You're home early, she said, glancing at Ethan as he loosened his tie. He nodded. Slow day. Lucky you. She smiled, crossing to the stove. I've got a new client dinner tomorrow. Big tech company from Palo Alto. They want us to handle their rebrand. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her. That sounds good. She turned, sensing something in his tone. You sound thrilled. Just tired, he said. Long week. She laughed, light and polished. You've been saying that a lot lately. Maybe you need a break. We both do. Maybe after the quarter closes we can take a trip. Just the two of us. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his wine glass, studied the reflection on the surface, and said, Madison, do you ever wonder how well you know someone? She blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? He looked at her, then really looked. I mean, sometimes people build versions of themselves so carefully that you forget to question what's underneath. Her smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. Okay, philosopher. Should I be jealous? You sound like a man who's been reading too many mystery novels. Ethan smiled faintly but didn't laugh. Maybe. She walked over, brushing a hand across his shoulder. You've been quiet lately. Work stress. He looked at her hand but didn't move. Something like that. She tilted her head. You can talk to me, you know. Whatever's going on, we're in this together. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. That's what I'm trying to figure out, who I can still trust. The air froze. Madison's hand dropped from his shoulder. She gave a soft laugh, but her voice sounded thinner now. Well, you can start with me. He nodded once, expression unreadable, then walked to the living room, leaving his half-finished glass behind. Madison stood there for a moment staring after him. She picked up the glass, the stem trembling slightly between her fingers, then set it down too hard on the counter. The sound cracked the quiet like a warning. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his study, scrolling through financial reports. His eyes stopped on the vendor name listed in the anonymous email, Orion Creative Partners. He searched it. The website looked legitimate. Too legitimate. It had been created 6 months ago. Meanwhile, Madison sat on the edge of their bed upstairs staring at her phone. She opened her email, hovered over her sent folder, and then closed it again. Her reflection in the vanity mirror looked flawless, but her pulse betrayed her. Downstairs, Ethan printed the vendor report and placed it beside the anonymous email. The paper edges lined up perfectly like pieces waiting to form a picture he didn't want to see. Outside, rain kept sliding down the windows. In this city, even light looked tired of pretending. Trust breaks the same way glass does, slowly, then all at once. My mother called before she showed up, which meant she was already halfway down the hall when I answered. She had never learned how to announce a visit like a normal person. She simply arrived bearing food as both apology and distraction. When I opened the door, the smell of baked apples and cinnamon wrapped around her like a shield. I made pie, she said, holding up the tin like an offering. Your favorite. I stepped aside. You mean Dad's favorite? She gave a faint smile, setting the pie down on the counter. Maybe both. The kitchen filled with that warm, sugary scent that used to mean comfort. Now it only made me feel 12 again, waiting for my turn to speak while everyone else talked over me. My mother took a seat at the small kitchen table, smoothing her scarf as if it could iron out whatever she didn't want to say. So she began studying my face, you and your sister. You'll sort things out, right? I grabbed 2 plates, cutting the pie into neat slices. I'm not the one who needs sorting. Lauren. Her tone carried that careful softness she used when she wanted something. Madison's under a lot of pressure. She's worked hard to keep this family's name alive since your father passed. You know how much she carries. I set a slice in front of her, the knife scraping the plate a little too loud. And I carry silence. She looked up, startled, then immediately looked away. That's not fair, she said quietly. You've always been sensitive. I leaned back, folding my arms. No, Mom, I've always been quiet. There's a difference. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The steam from her coffee curled upward, ghostly and fragile. She focused on it like it had the answers she didn't. Families survive, she said finally, because someone knows when not to speak. I stared at her, trying to find a trace of regret in her voice, something that sounded like truth. But all I heard was training. Years of hosting dinners, smiling through gossip, protecting reputations like they were family heirlooms. You really believe that I asked? She hesitated. I believe some things are better left unsaid. Even when silence becomes a lie, her lips pressed together. Lips pressed. You don't understand what it was like after your father died. People were waiting for us to fall apart. Madison held everything together. I almost laughed. By building a story everyone else had to live in. Lauren, I stood, suddenly too tired to keep the peace. You didn't come here to talk about family, Mom. You came here to talk about damage control. She flinched like I'd hit her. Then she straightened the way she always did when words didn't go her way. You think you know everything, but you only ever see half the picture? I see enough, I said softly. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping across the tile. You can't change what people choose to believe. Maybe not. I said, but I can stop pretending I believe it too. She blinked, eyes glistening, then turned toward the door. Take care of yourself, Lauren. When she was gone, the apartment felt bigger but emptier. The smell of pie lingered cloying. I stood there for a while staring at the two untouched slices on the table. Eventually, I walked to my desk, the same one I'd bought when I quit Riverside. It was cluttered with case files, invoices, and one old folder that hadn't been opened in years. The label read 2020, Internal Audit. I hesitated before pulling it free. Inside were printouts from an old project back when I still worked under Madison. A memo marked confidential caught my eye. I read it twice before I felt the twist in my stomach. It authorized a public relations emergency fund signed by Madison Reed and co-signed by Margaret Reed, my mother. The numbers were small, nothing compared to the hundreds of thousands Sophie had shown me, but it wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the precedent, the first crack. Madison hadn't acted alone. She'd been taught that keeping up appearances mattered more than telling the truth, and my mother had helped her learn it. I closed the folder, slowly pressing my hand against the cover. The rain outside had started again, a soft, steady rhythm against the window. I thought about what my mother said, that families survive because someone knows when not to speak. Maybe that was true for her generation. Maybe silence had kept her alive in a world where women were expected to endure. But for me, silence had become something else entirely, a cage built out of politeness and fear. In families like ours, silence isn't golden. It's guilt, polished to shine. The conference room at Riverside smelled like burnt coffee and recycled air. A dozen monitors hummed quietly, the glow of spreadsheets reflecting off glass walls. It was mid-January gray skies pressing low against downtown. The city outside looked half asleep, but inside the building everyone was wide awake in the worst way. Tight voices, tense shoulders, the sound of corporate fear hiding behind professionalism. Eric Nolan sat at the end of the table, glasses low on his nose, flipping through a binder thick with printed invoices. He was an external compliance officer brought in from Portland, calm, methodical, a man who'd seen too many cover-ups to be impressed by another one. Sophie sat across from him. Her laptop open, typing furiously. These invoices all route to the same account, Eric said without looking up. Same vendor ID, same routing number, but under different names. Sophie nodded. We traced them through Orion Creative Partners. The agency's real, but the subsidiary on the invoices doesn't exist. Registered 6 months ago under a Shell LLC in California. Eric frowned. You verify the address? Yeah, Sophie said, scrolling through her screen. It's an apartment in San Francisco, leased under Daniel Reyes. Eric leaned back, let out a slow whistle. Vice President of Finance. Yep. She didn't look up. The guy who was supposed to approve these reports? The room went quiet except for the whirring of computers. Then the door opened. Ethan Brooks stepped in. He didn't say anything at first, just scanned the faces in the room. He wore a dark gray suit, no tie sleeves rolled to the forearms, like a man who'd stopped pretending to care about appearances. He took the seat beside Eric and looked at the monitor. Show me. Sophie clicked through the files. Numbers scrolled fast across the screen. Dates, amounts, account codes. Ethan watched each one like he was memorizing them. When the last page loaded, he said, Document everything. Quietly. I don't want this leaking before we understand the scope. Eric nodded. Understood. Sophie hesitated. What about Madison? Ethan's eyes stayed on the screen. We'll get there. After he left, the tension in the room snapped like a held breath. Sophie exhaled hard and muttered, He knows. Eric packed his notes. He's known for days. He's just been waiting to see who else would say it out loud. Later that week, I got the call. Riverside's HR director reached out under the pretense of consulting assistance. It wasn't unusual. I'd done freelance work for them before, but this time the tone was different. We're reviewing vendor records from past years, she said. We'd like your help auditing the marketing accounts from 2019. The number made my chest tighten. 2019. The year Madison and I stopped speaking. 2 days later, I walked back into Riverside for the first time in almost 5 years. The lobby was the same, marble floors, the same logo etched into glass, but everything felt smaller. People looked up as I walked through, curious. I ignored them, following the receptionist's directions to the internal audit room. Inside, Sophie was there. She gave a faint smile. Didn't think I'd see you here again. Guess we both like bad ideas, I said. She gestured toward a desk. The archived vendor records are loaded there. Madison's department files are marked in blue. I sat down, logged in, and started scrolling. My name was buried deep in the system as an external consultant, which meant I had access but no authority. A ghost in the machine. Page after page, the numbers repeated their rhythm. Vendor names, invoice IDs, payment dates. At first, it was just data, cold and meaningless. But then I saw it, Madison's digital signature looping, and elegant sitting on top of every authorization. My stomach twisted. I didn't realize Ethan had entered the room until his reflection appeared in the screen beside mine. "You recognize something?" he asked quietly. I turned to face him. "Just a pattern." He nodded once, eyes scanning the monitor. "Good. Keep looking." Then he left as quietly as he came. The rest of the afternoon blurred into numbers and silence. By the time I left the building, the rain had started again, Seattle doing what it did best, pretending to wash everything clean. I was halfway down the hall when I heard his voice behind me. "Lauren." I stopped. Ethan was standing near the elevator's coat over his arm, expression unreadable. "You sent the email, didn't you?" For a second, all I could hear was the hum of the elevator cables. I met his eyes. "You already knew, no," he said softly, "but I was hoping someone would." We stood there caught between guilt and understanding. Then he pressed the elevator button. "This will get worse before it gets better," he said. "I know." He stepped inside the doors, sliding shut between us. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and cold air. I pulled my coat tighter and started walking, each step echoing against the empty street. Justice doesn't knock. It waits for the right door to open. The mood inside Riverside had shifted. You could feel it in the air, like static before a storm. Conversations dimmed when Madison walked by. Smiles disappeared as quickly as they came. Rumors moved through the office like wind through tall grass, quiet, but impossible to stop. The word audit was on everyone's lips, but no one dared say it too loudly. By mid-February, Madison looked different. Her hair was still perfect, her clothes immaculate, but the edges of her control had started to fray. The practiced laugh she used in meetings now came half a second too late. Her tone, once calm and sharp, had started to sound brittle. Even her heels clicked faster down the hallway, like she was running from something no one could see. I watched her from across the lobby once. She passed Sophie without even a glance, but Sophie's eyes followed her the way a fuse watches it spark. That night, Madison cornered Daniel Reyes in the underground parking garage. Sophie would later tell me what happened. Security footage filled in the rest. Madison's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "You're cleaning this up, right?" Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead, glancing around as if the shadows were listening. "I already deleted the files," he said. "But Sophie has backups. I think Ethan knows." Madison's eyes went cold. "Then make it disappear," she hissed. "I can't." Daniel stammered. "They've already got the copies. Once compliance verifies it's over." She didn't answer. She just turned away, heels slamming the pavement as she yanked her car door open. The sound of metal and fury echoed through the empty garage before the car sped off into the night. Back at her condo, she must have stared at her phone for hours before dialing my mother's number. Margaret was in Portland by then, living in the same house she'd shared with my father. She answered, on the second ring, "Madison." "Mom," Madison's voice trembled, the bravado stripped away. "If someone asks, tell them you approved that PR expense from 2020. Just once, please." There was a pause on the line long enough to hear Margaret's breath catch. "Madison." "What have you done?" "Nothing illegal," Madison said too fast. "Just gray areas. I just need you to trust me." "Okay." "You always said family comes first." Margaret's voice cracked. "Family doesn't mean lying." "I'm not lying," Madison whispered. "I'm surviving." The call ended with silence. My mother sat alone afterward, the receiver still in her hand, staring at the framed photo of my father on the fireplace. Her fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the glass. "I protected you too much," she said into the empty room. Meanwhile, at Riverside, Sophie was in the audit room with Eric. The hum of machines filled the air. Screens glowed with rows of proof that could end careers. Sophie scrolled through the final report, double-checking every figure. "This is it," she said quietly. "Every signature, every payment trail, every fake invoice." Eric nodded. "You sure you're ready to put your name on it?" "I already did," she said. "I just didn't sign it in ink." They printed the final report, 57 pages thick, and bound it in blue. Sophie slid it across the table to Ethan later that afternoon. He read the first page, then the last, then closed it. "Irrefutable. Completely," she said. Ethan's jaw tightened. "When do we present it?" "Board's meeting next week, before the Christmas break." He gave a slow nod and looked toward the window. The city lights were just starting to come on, shimmering through sheets of drizzle. His reflection stared back at him, calm, tired, ready. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "And Sophie, keep your head down until this is over." She left the folder on his desk. For a long time after he didn't move, I can only imagine what he was thinking in that moment. Maybe he was replaying the same memories I was. The dinners, the laughter, the illusion of family that Madison built like a brand. Maybe he realized, like I did, that truth doesn't pick sides. That night I couldn't sleep. My inbox was full of quiet updates, files from Sophie short messages without emotion. One line from her stood out. "He's going to tell the board himself." I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker in the rain. Downtown looked blurred, as if the city itself didn't want to see what was coming. It was strange to think that something as small as an email could set off a chain reaction that would shatter every carefully built lie. I thought of Madison again, how she used to braid my hair when we were kids, how she used to say, "Don't ever let people see you sweat." She had lived her whole life by that rule, but I knew what she didn't. When the truth rises, it doesn't ask who's ready to face it. It just shines. The Fairmont ballroom shimmered like a snow globe. Too bright, too perfect, full of people pretending the year hadn't broken anyone. Riverside's annual Christmas gala was the same ritual every December. Glittering chandeliers, towers of champagne, and laughter that sounded just a little too rehearsed. The air carried the smell of roses, perfume, and expensive anxiety. Madison arrived in red, not the soft kind of red that warms a room, the sharp kind that warns you to stay out of her way. Her smile was precise, her posture unshakable. If anyone had whispered about her over the last year, she didn't show it. Ethan walked beside her, composed as always, though there was something colder about his silence tonight. The distance between them wasn't physical, it was moral. I watched them enter from my seat near the edge of the room. My mother sat beside me, fidgeting with her bracelet, pretending to read the event program. She hadn't seen Madison in months. When Madison caught our table in her periphery, she smiled for the cameras. The kind of smile that photographs well, but means nothing. "She looks beautiful," my mother said softly. "She looks like she's trying not to drown," I murmured. Around us, the party pulsed with polite conversation and shallow laughter. Waiters glided between tables with trays of champagne. The music swelled, the lights dimmed to gold, and everything felt staged. Madison thrived in settings like this, rooms where image mattered more than truth. She floated from table to table, shaking hands, touching shoulders, weaving charm like it was currency. I could almost admire it. Almost. Then she saw me. Her eyes lingered a moment too long, like she hadn't expected I'd come. She recovered quickly, smiling for her small circle of admirers. "Family's important," she said loudly, glass in hand. Heads turned toward her. "And this is my sister Lauren. Still finding her purpose, I think." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. People looked my way, half embarrassed, half curious. I didn't move. I just met her gaze, steady and unflinching. The silence stretched just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then Ethan stood. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, set down his glass, and said, "Interesting, but you're our failure. We're done." The words dropped like stones into water. The room froze. Madison's smile faltered, first at the corners, then entirely. Her hand trembled. The wineglass slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the marble floor. The sound was sharp and final. Red wine spread across the tiles, seeping into the cracks like blood on snow. No one breathed. I could hear the hum of the lights, the faint clink of someone setting down a fork. A few people lifted their phones, uncertain whether to record or pretend they weren't witnessing something sacred and cruel. Ethan reached into his jacket, pulled out a thin folder, and placed it on the nearest table. Every signature, every transfer, every account, he said, voice, even eyes fixed on her. "Your name, Madison." The air seemed to collapse around his words. Madison shook her head, her lipstick cracking as she whispered, No, that's not. It's all there," Ethan said. "The board has it. Compliance has it. The truth has it." Margaret covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. She looked from one daughter to the other like searching for someone to save. Madison's face was pale now, her eyes wide panic blooming beneath the surface. She reached for Ethan's arm, but he stepped back. "You did this to yourself," he said quietly. Her knees bent slightly, just enough that I thought she might fall, but she didn't. Madison Reed never fell where people could see it. She straightened her back, forced a shaky laugh, and said, "This is a misunderstanding. The room didn't buy it." They could all feel the truth. The way a lie dies before it reaches the air. I sat still, watching. Not because I wanted this, but because part of me had known it would always end this way. She'd built her world on control, and now it was slipping through her fingers piece by piece. Ethan looked at me once across the room. His eyes met mine, steady, almost apologetic. Then, he walked away. Madison stood frozen, red wine staining her shoes, the glass shards glittering at her feet like tiny mirrors. The guests began whispering, the hum of gossip spreading like wildfire. Phones lit up again. Emails, messages, photos, already flying across the city before the music even stopped. My mother reached for my hand. "Lauren, do something." "What would you have me do?" I asked softly. Madison turned, then her eyes landing on me. For a second, her face softened. No pride, no hatred, just recognition. Maybe she saw what I saw, the small, tired truth that all of this was inevitable. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The room dimmed around us. The music had stopped, yet the silence carried its own rhythm. People whispered, shifted, avoided eye contact. Someone bent down to pick up the broken glass. I stayed seated, my hands folded neatly on my lap. It wasn't revenge that made them quiet. It was recognition. Everyone saw a piece of themselves in her fall. By Christmas Eve morning, the city was already awake to the sound of scandal. Every TV screen in Seattle flickered with the same headline, the same footage looping over and over again. CEO exposes fiancé's fraud at company gala. The anchor's voice was smooth, detached, the kind of tone reserved for both tragedy and entertainment. The clip played in slow motion. Madison's glass falling, red wine spilling across the marble, the camera flash of a phone catching her expression just before it shattered. They replayed it from 3 different angles. It didn't matter that no one outside that ballroom knew what really happened. The image told its own story. The internet filled in the rest. By noon, #Riverside Scandal was trending nationwide. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, everyone had an opinion. Power couple implodes. Corporate love story turns courtroom drama. Another CEO takes a moral stand. Someone even slowed down Ethan's line. "You're our failure," and turned it into a remix. The world doesn't wait for truth. It just wants a story. At Madison's apartment downtown, the blinds stayed closed. Her phone buzzed until the battery died. Texts from reporters, colleagues, people who claimed to be friends. A few messages said they believed her. Most didn't. She tried turning on the TV once, but seeing her own face under the Chiron disgraced executive, under investigation, made her throw the remote across the room. It cracked against the wall, the batteries rolling under the couch. Outside, a delivery guy left a wreath on her door. She didn't answer the knock. Across town, Ethan gave his resignation to the Riverside board. His statement was short, 2 sentences citing ethical accountability and leadership integrity. Reporters surrounded him outside the building. "Mr. Brooks." "Do you regret making it public?" one called out. He stopped just long enough to look at the cameras. "Some things shouldn't stay hidden," he said. Then he walked away. Daniel Reyes didn't walk anywhere. He was taken from his home in handcuffs 2 days later. The footage showed him ducking his head, avoiding the reporters shouting his name. His lawyer's statement was predictable. "My client is cooperating fully." Sophie and Eric finalized the last audit documents that same week, both signatures now evidence in a case bigger than either of them imagined. Sophie sent me a 1-line message that night. "It's over, but it doesn't feel like victory." I knew what she meant. The morning after, my phone buzzed with a call from my mother. She didn't say hello, just breathed for a moment, the kind of breath that comes before confession. "I thought I was protecting her," she said finally, voice shaking. I closed my eyes. "You were protecting an illusion, Mom. The truth doesn't need protection." She cried quietly on the other end, the way people cry when they're realizing how long they've been holding something in. "I raised you both to be strong," she said between sobs. "I didn't think strength could look so different." "Madison's strength was built on appearances," I said softly. "Yours was built on silence. Neither one lasts forever. She didn't answer, only the faint sound of her breathing, then the soft click of the line ending. By afternoon, news vans lined the street outside Riverside's headquarters. Employees slipped through the back entrance, avoiding the swarm of microphones. Inside, security escorted Madison's things, framed photos, awards, the nameplate from her office, out in a cardboard box. No one said a word. The company's PR statement came out by evening. Riverside & Company has terminated all employees involved in the falsification of financial records. The board remains committed to transparency. It didn't name Madison directly. It didn't have to. That night I stood by my window and watched the city glow with holiday lights. Families walked past with shopping bags, laughter echoing through the street. The world kept spinning indifferent. I thought about Madison's red dress, the sound of glass breaking, the way her eyes looked just before it all fell apart. She'd spent her whole life chasing control, and when it finally slipped away, she didn't even try to grab it back. People would say Ethan exposed her. But the truth was simpler. Madison exposed herself the moment she believed she was untouchable. In America, reputation collapses faster than snow melts, but guilt lingers like winter itself. By February, Seattle had thawed a little, but the cold lingered in places you couldn't see. Riverside's headquarters looked different now. The glass panels gleamed brighter. The lobby smelled like new paint, and a polished brass plaque near the entrance displayed the company's new leadership team. Madison's name wasn't on it anymore. The press releases had been rewritten. Every archived mention of her accomplishments, her awards, her projects. Gone. It was as if she'd never existed inside those walls. The company issued a new slogan about transparency and rebuilding trust. I wondered if they understood how thin that word could stretch before it snapped. Inside, people moved faster. Meetings ran longer. No one spoke Madison's name, but you could feel the echo of it in every room. Sophie told me over coffee that HR had rolled out corporate healing workshops. I laughed. She didn't. "Do you ever feel bad for her?" she asked. Sometimes I admitted, but mostly I feel tired. A month later, I heard my mother's voice again, but this time, it came in a letter. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, handwritten in her looping script. Lauren. I started volunteering at the women's shelter downtown. I help them write resumes, fill out job applications, sometimes just listen. For the first time, I'm not pretending to fix things that can't be fixed. And I think that's what honesty feels like. Love, Mom. I read it twice, tracing the indent of her pen marks. For the first time in a long time, I believed her. Work had become quieter for me, too. I'd taken on small consulting projects again, nonprofits, community ventures, the kind of work that didn't require performance or perfection. My office overlooked Lake Union, the same view I used to find lonely. Now it just felt honest. That morning, the mail carrier dropped off another envelope. No return address. Just my name typed neatly. Inside was a folded article printed on cream-colored paper. The headline read, "Anonymous Whistleblower Saves Riverside." Below it, a single line in italics: "Courage isn't loud. It's consistent." The byline belonged to Grace Turner, an investigative journalist I'd met briefly years ago at a conference. I hadn't spoken to her since. I set the paper down on my desk, my fingers still pressed against the edges. My chest felt tight, not from fear this time, but from something closer to release. No one would ever know it was me, not officially. The board would close its investigation, the company would move on, and Madison would fade into the quiet corners of business lore. The fallen executive, they'd whisper. But I knew the truth. I folded the article carefully and slid it into the top drawer of my desk next to my father's old watch. It wasn't pride I felt, just the weight of closure light, but certain. Around that same time, Madison's lawyer called. I wasn't supposed to know the details, but news travels faster than paperwork. The case was settled out of court. No trial, no cameras, no apologies. She'd lost her licenses and her career in corporate finance for at least 5 years. A reporter on the evening news described it as a measured outcome. I wondered if Madison thought so too. That weekend, I drove to Portland to visit my mother. The women's shelter sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the kind where houses still had picket fences and mailboxes, with names painted on them. I found her in the office sorting donation forms. She looked older, softer, somehow, in a faded cardigan and jeans. When she saw me, she smiled, really smiled. for the first time in years. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I needed to see where you finally stopped pretending." She laughed, shaking her head. "You sound like your father." We spent the afternoon making coffee, helping one of the women with a job application. My mother spoke gently with a patience I didn't remember from my childhood. Maybe she'd found her version of peace. Maybe this was hers to fix after all. Driving back to Seattle that night, I thought about Madison, where she might be, what she might be doing. I imagined her in a smaller apartment, the kind where you hear the neighbors through the walls trying to fill silence with something other than denial. People said karma was poetic. I didn't think so. It wasn't vengeance or irony. It was math. Inevitable, balanced, patient. Karma doesn't arrive in anger. It walks in quietly, carrying consequences in both hands. The rain in Portland fell differently than it did in Seattle. Softer, somehow slower, like the city was tired of rushing. I parked a block away from the cafe and walked the rest of the distance under a gray sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain or snow. The place was small, warm, light wooden tables, the faint sound of jazz playing from a speaker hidden behind a plant. Madison was already there, sitting by the window, a half-empty mug in front of her. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, just quieter. No makeup, no jewelry, no armor. When she saw me, she stood, then sat back down just as quickly, like she wasn't sure which gesture fit anymore. I hung my coat on the chair opposite hers and sat down. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The rain did it for us. "You won." "You know," she said finally, her voice soft, without accusation. I stirred the sugar into my coffee, watching it swirl. No one wins when truth costs this much. She looked down, thumb tracing the rim of her mug. When the glass fell, she said I thought Ethan would look at me with hate. But he just looked through me. Like he'd already decided I wasn't worth seeing. I met her eyes. He wasn't looking at you. He was looking at what was left of honesty. Her shoulders slumped. She let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I guess that's fair. For a while, we just sat there. The sound of the espresso machine hissed behind us, and the world went on. People coming in, shaking off umbrellas, talking about things that mattered to them. It felt strange sitting there with the person who had once made my life so small. Madison spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm taking night classes at the community college. Business ethics, if you can believe it. No more shortcuts." I smiled, small but real. "That's the best apology I could have asked for." She nodded, eyes glassy. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I needed to start somewhere." "It's enough," I said. She stared out the window, watching people cross the street. "Mom says you're working with nonprofits now." "Yeah, smaller clients. Real people. Feels cleaner." "That suits you," she said quietly. "You were always better at doing things the right way." I shook my head. "No, Madison. I just had less to lose." She looked back at me, a hint of the old fire flickering. "You lost plenty." Maybe I admitted, but I gained peace. She smiled at that. An honest smile this time, tired, but true. "I used to think peace was something you earned," she said. "Now I think it's something you stop fighting against." I leaned back, taking a sip of my coffee. The bitterness grounded me. "That's a good lesson. You should write that down." She laughed softly. "Maybe I will, after finals." The light outside had shifted. Snow began to mix with the rain, small white flecks clinging to the window pane. We both watched them, letting the silence stretch without discomfort. Madison glanced at her phone, then put it face down on the table. "You know, I thought I'd never be able to face you again. After everything. You showed up," I said. "That's more than most people would do." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "Do you ever think about Dad?" "All the time," I said, "but not the way I used to." I stopped trying to figure out what he would have wanted. "It doesn't matter now. I think he'd be proud of you." I gave a small smile. "He'd probably just ask why I didn't go back to Riverside." Madison laughed again. Soft, fleeting. "Yeah, that sounds like him." The waiter came by, refilled our coffees, asked if we needed anything else. Neither of us did. When he left, the quiet returned, but it wasn't heavy. "I should let you go." Madison said eventually. "You've got your own life now. So do you." I said, "You just haven't met it yet." She nodded, standing. I did the same. For a moment, we just looked at each other, unsure if a hug was appropriate, or too much, or not enough. Then she stepped forward and I let her. The embrace was brief but real. When we pulled apart, she smiled faintly. Thanks for coming. Thanks for asking. She put on her coat, pulled up the hood, and left. Through the fogged window, I watched her walk down the sidewalk until the snow swallowed her up. Outside, the flakes fell thicker now, soft and silent, like they were trying to erase the edges of the world. I sat there a while longer, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my palms. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just makes carrying it possible. Christmas came quietly that year. No dinner parties, no speeches, no champagne towers. Just light snow falling over Lake Union, and a city humming under strings of white lights. My new apartment was small, but the kind of small that felt earned. Clean lines, warm wood. One plant I somehow hadn't killed yet. The place smelled faintly of pine and candle wax, and for the first time in years, it smelled like home. A soft instrumental playlist played in the background, something calm enough to make the silence feel full instead of empty. On the desk near the window sat a single sheet of paper, a signed contract with a local healthcare nonprofit, the first major client for Reed Advisory Group. I'd registered the business 9 months earlier, mostly out of stubbornness. Now it was real. The ink had barely dried, but I ran my hand over it anyway, just to be sure. Beside it sat a holiday card from my mother. She'd started sending them again, handwritten every December. This one was short. You taught me silence can be brave. I kept it propped open, the ink still slightly smudged near the edge like she'd hesitated before writing it. The city lights shimmered through the window, their reflections dancing across the surface of the water below. Somewhere across the lake, laughter echoed faintly the sound of people celebrating something simple. I poured myself a glass of red wine, the kind my father used to buy every Christmas, and sat by the window, watching the snow float down like dust over glass. It was strange how peace could sneak up on you when you weren't looking for it. For so long I'd lived in noise. Family, noise, work. Noise, the sound of other people's expectations grinding against my own. Now there was none of that. Just quiet. I thought of Madison, though, not the version of her that lived on the front page of the Seattle Post, or the one that haunted corporate forums online. I thought of the version who braided my hair before school, who made me promise never to apologize for being different. Maybe she'd found her version of quiet, too. Ethan crossed my mind next. We hadn't spoken since the board meeting that ended it all, but I'd seen a small blurb about him in a business magazine last month, consulting for an environmental foundation, now no titles, no spotlight. It suited him. He'd always been better at building things that lasted, not just things that looked impressive. And then there was my father. Sometimes I still caught myself wondering what he'd think if he could see us now. His family scattered but still standing. Maybe he'd recognize that the pieces of us that broke were the ones that needed to. I raised the glass slightly, just enough to catch the reflection of the Christmas lights outside. To Truth, I whispered the words barely audible. The wine tasted deep, full of the kind of bitterness that reminded you'd survived something. Somewhere across the street, someone laughed too loudly, the sound of glass clinking faintly after. It was ordinary, nothing special. But the sound made my chest tighten. That small, familiar noise. The echo of everything that had started this. For a second I was back at that first dinner, the heat of shame crawling up my neck, the weight of every unspoken word. But it didn't hurt anymore. It just lived there like a scar that didn't need covering. A year later, no one talked about that night. Not at Riverside, not in my family, not anywhere. But sometimes when glasses clink, I remember, justice doesn't need noise. It doesn't demand applause or headlines. It just waits. For truth, for time, for someone brave enough to open the door when it knocks. I took another sip and let the warmth settle in my chest. Outside, the snow had picked up again, turning the street into something soft and quiet. The city lights blurred against the glass, and for a moment I couldn't tell where the reflections ended, and my own face began. I smiled faintly and set the glass down beside the contract. If you've ever been called a failure, remember this. Justice doesn't need an audience. It just needs you to stand on the side of truth